Hello? Hello? First of all, really? You can, it's okay. It's not, and that's not a classroom. You don't have to go to the back of the room, and no one's going to call on you. It's okay. You can move to the front. Husband, you can come to the front. Seriously? Okay. Hello. Good evening. And good evening to all the people that are watching us through our live stream and several that have stayed on Zoom. So good evening to everybody. This evening I have the privilege of introducing Philip Kadish. Kadish, okay. We've had a debate on how to pronounce the name. Sorry, Kadish, who is a professor of American Studies at Pace University in New York City. Dr. Kadish has a PhD in American literature and culture. His specialty is the impact of scientific racism on U.S. culture. His op-eds connecting contemporary racial issues to their roots in 19th century American culture have appeared on CNN.com and NBC.com. For those of you who have read the book, I know that you found it inspiring, awakening, insightful, and those are just a couple of the adjectives I can use. For those of you who have not read it, I'm sure you're going to find this to be a very eye-opening evening, and you will run out of here and read the book without a doubt. So I would like to introduce to you Dr. Philip Kadish.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right? Oh, excellent. It's wonderful to be here and to meet you all. And here's my strategy. There's a lot of history to be covered in the book and lots of different... Oh, is this better? Yes. Thank you. I haven't been on Oprah lately, so I haven't gotten the right distance. So there's going to be a lot of time covered in the book, almost 200 years, a lot of different concepts. And I thought that perhaps the best way to start would just be to tell you a story and let you meet some people and bring you into one of the episodes that I cover in the book before I then tell you a little bit more broadly about the larger conception of the book. I'm hoping that'll be a little bit easier way in. So, thank you very much. So, you know what? My next slide is kind of dense, and I'm actually going to skip over it because as a teacher, I can tell you that often, especially if you're just starting out, you have something very dense to start out with, and people's minds go white. So I'm just going to tell you very quickly. So the title of my book is The Great White Hoax, 2 Centuries of Selling Racism in America. And essentially, here's what I would say as a very quick introduction. I would say that my book, especially in terms of its relevance now, is that what we have called, many people have called the crisis of truth in the US now, in our politics and in media, which feels very novel, like a novel crisis, has in fact been with us for a long time and is more of a return to form in US culture than an aberration. The other quick thing that I'll say is that the kinds of hoaxes that I cover in this book, invented evidence meant to prove racist concepts and support racist policies, best known, particularly here, would be Henry Ford's propagation of the Protocols of Zion, which we will have time to talk about today. So the quick thing I would say, just to set us in context, is that my research found that the Protocols of Zion being promoted by Henry Ford was not a fluke. In fact, it was part of a larger pattern in US political culture and racial culture that my book uncovered. So I'm actually going to skip over the next kind of dense looking, see? Oh my God, too much stuff. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start out by introducing you to a mensch. This is a wonderful man, Sidney Kaplan, and we're going to start with his story. So Sidney Kaplan was born in New York City, and he ended up serving in the US Army during the Second World War. And when he came home from the war, he was based with his family on an army base near Boston, and he had attended Harvard on the GI Bill after he got out and was studying history. And in the late 1940s, or around 1947, 48, he was horrified by the advent of the Dixiecrats. Right? So just to update you guys, after the Second World War, really starting especially in 1948, the US finally, after almost 100 years, started to move against Southern segregation. Started to move towards having real civil rights laws that would push back against segregation in the South. And in response, the Southern Democrats, who controlled the politics in the South, moved to secede from the Democratic Party and run their own candidate for president in an effort to try and protect segregation. And in the process of that, are you guys hearing me okay on this? Is this working well? Good, okay. In the process of that, a lot of intensely racist language was in the news, in newspapers, on the radio, in terms of reporting about this. And Kaplan was particularly horrified, having just finished the war against the Nazis, to have such an intense level of white supremacist, racist language so saturating the country again. And in particular, there's a word on the bottom of the screen here, he kept hearing this term, the term miscegenation. And so this, depending on your age, this may either be familiar or totally foreign to you. This was, until I'd say the late 1960s, the American term for race mixing. Let's see, what have I got next? Okay, I'm gonna push this back. So here's our story. We have Kaplan, and he gets very upset. He gets very upset that here in this country, especially after coming back from fighting the Nazis, trying to make a new world, having, yes?
I just got a message from people on streaming that they cannot hear you.
Okay.
Maybe the other mic is better.
Okay. So you guys can hear me. Oh, this even sounds louder to me. Ah, very good, very good. I'm glad for the technical impact. Okay, so
Notice the communications. In 10 seconds, you got a note on her watch that they couldn't hear you.
I love it. So those of you mostly in Florida, maybe, feel free to text in your questions later. I love it. All right, so I'll try to move a little faster. Here we go. Kaplan is horrified by this racist language and intense white supremacism resurging in the United States after the Second World War. And what can he do? Well, he's become a history scholar. He's become a historian. So, like me, what would I do? I might have lots of grand ideas, but probably I would go to the library, which is what Kaplan did. So what he initially learns is that he says, well, where did this word come from? Where did this word miscegenation come from? That means race mixing in the US, but carried an intense weight. And I'll be curious when we have questions later, I'll be curious if any of you remember the intensity behind that word in this country. It carried with it not just the meaning of race mixing, it really meant mixed species, and it really carried a sense of kind of a biological abomination. That was the kind of weight that it carried in this country. That word was, and that term and the moral opprobrium behind it was often brought up whenever there were lynchings in the South. So it was a very intense part of US culture. He went to go research this. It turns out the word was invented in 1864. And I think he, like myself, both of us historians of race in the US, were probably expecting the same sort of thing, which would have been, there must have been some scientist that invented this and came up with this. Instead, he found a very strange story. It came from this pamphlet in 1864. The pamphlet coined the word miscegenation, meaning mixed species, as a replacement for an old word for race mixing, amalgamation. And this pamphlet, he learned, claimed that Republicans, this was Lincoln's party, 1864 is the year of Lincoln's re-election campaign. The pamphlet claims that Republicans plan to merge the black and white races after the Civil War, which is to say, if Lincoln wins the election, into a new American race as a way to solve the race problem. Needless to say, at the time, this caused a scandal in the midst of that re-election campaign. And all that Kaplan could find out from the sources at the time was it was supposed to have been written by a rather naive abolitionist, someone opposed to slavery. A bit of a crazy story. Like me, his impulse is, let me go to the library. Well, here is a bit of serendipity. There were copies of this pamphlet in libraries and archives and historical societies around the country. If he had gone to any of them except the one he went to, he wouldn't have found anything different. He would have just found this pamphlet and wondered why someone would have written it at the time. Instead, he found this. Tucked inside this particular pamphlet in a place in Boston called the Boston Athenaeum, which is an old library dating back to the 1700s. There, a copy of it included this little letter, handwritten letter, dated 1900, so 36 years after the hoax. And in the letter, a woman confesses that her husband had written the pamphlet as a political hoax, and that her husband, it turned out, had been the editor of a Democratic Party-aligned newspaper in New York City called The World. The World eventually went on to be owned, I believe, by a Pulitzer and had its own storied career. Sorry. So let me just see, what's my next one? Oh, great. So what he finds out, and what I was stunned to find out at the very beginning of my research, was that this term, which had a long, long and bloody career in US culture and in US race relations, had come not from what I learned to call an earnest racist, but really from a deceptive, troublemaking, we'll learn to think about how we want to talk about it, but came out of a hoax. And so here's the basic story. This is a man named David Goodman Crowley. He was an Irish immigrant, and he ended up as the editor of the New York World newspaper in the 1860s. And he was invested in Lincoln not winning. So just to catch you guys up and reorient you, at this point, the Republicans are the anti-slavery party, and New York was a Democratic town. New York City, the vast majority of people in New York City were pro-slavery. From a combination, the upper classes had a lot of business interest in slavery. They sold insurance to Southern slaveholders. They bought Southern cotton, all kinds of things. And working class white people, particularly in the New York area, had been sort of, the idea in that area was that freed African Americans would be competition for their labor and would drive wages down. So New York City was really a kind of pro-slavery town. So he's in New York. He's interested in doing some combination of seeing if he can push Lincoln into losing the election, or in the very least doing some mischief. And so what he does is he recruits one of his journalists to help him, and they forge a pamphlet. And so basically one thing they knew was that the American taboo, intense taboo around race mixing, had been used for decades to try to stall anti-slavery efforts. And he knew that that was a great button to push, try to push back anything around the end of slavery in the US. But it was always about discussing amalgamation. And he knew if he tried to just publish something that said, Lincoln likes amalgamation, everybody would have their antenna up. So he decides, we need another word. So people's antenna won't go up. They invent this new word. He also knows, if I publish this in my newspaper under our name, no one will believe it. How do I get someone to believe it? I need to convince people that the Republicans, that Lincoln, that abolitionists are actively encouraging race mixing, and that will push white Americans' buttons in the North enough to have Lincoln lose the election, perhaps. So what they do is they write a fake pamphlet. They publish it anonymously, but then they send it out to abolitionists, to members of the Republican Party, asking for their endorsement. And essentially what the pamphlet is, sorry, wrong direction, thank you. The pamphlet is full, it's intentionally dry. It's sort of intentionally badly written. It's sort of made to seem like a kind of harmless crank a little bit. And it is anti-slavery, but it is also repeats the idea that people shouldn't be barred from who they should marry because of race, which was still a pretty radical notion at the time. And buried deep in the pamphlet was the claim that the Republican Party planned, if reelected, to launch a government-run program of mass interracial marriage and interracial sex. And this was, as absurd as it may sound, this was the claim buried in there. This was the secret poison pill that was in there. They managed to get a few overly credulous, rather naive and well-meaning abolitionist people to write back to them and offer them vaguely supportive letters, mostly saying, whoever you are, anonymous person, your heart's in the right place, but maybe don't lead with this right now in terms of us trying to move forward and getting Lincoln elected. But a couple of them write back. Mr. Crowley then packages up the pamphlet, these letters from actual abolitionists, sends them to a Democratic congressman. That congressman then denounces them on the floor of the Congress, and boom, you have a national scandal around this issue that dogs Lincoln all through the election. And let's see where I have next. So to give you an example of how big a story it was and how much it was became part of the culture, what we have here is two political cartoons from 1864. This one up here is called The Miscegenation Ball, and it shows white male abolitionists dancing scandalously, supposedly, with African-American women at a Republican Party get-together. And we see the word again on the bottom, miscegenation, or the millennium of abolitionism. And what we have here is Abraham Lincoln and Horace Greeley, the famous abolitionist newspaper editor, and Greeley's new African-American bride. And so, just to give you a sense of how quickly this new word spread around the country and the notion of this as a kind of scandal for the party, for the Republican Party. So, go back one more step. Essentially, as you all probably know, Lincoln, in fact, does win re-election. And it's mostly because the war turns around right before the election. So we've had this hoax, and because Lincoln won, the hoaxers don't reveal themselves. They just sort of slink back and disappear. But a couple years later, P.T. Barnum, famous showman, writes a book called Humbugs of the World about a whole range of hoaxes and fakeries, and he includes a detailed account of the miscegenation hoax. This is important because, for all of our discussion here today, because not only do we have an intentionally crafted, elaborate hoax to create false evidence of a racist claim meant to support a racist institution of slavery and to put into effect an election. But within 2 years of it happening, it was exposed very publicly. There's no better expert at the time on fakery than P.T. Barnum. His book, he was very famous. So at a certain level, that word should have disappeared by one thinking. It should have been exposed as a hoax, and any further power it had should have disappeared. Well, that's not what happened. America didn't pay any attention to this, and that word went on to become the word for race mixing in America for the next century or so, carrying a weight, a sense of scientific opprobrium against race mixing. And I want to show you one more thing. This is a cartoon that came out a couple years after the election. This says what miscegenation is and what we are to expect now that Mr. Lincoln is reelected. So this is a pamphlet that is not written by Crowley. It's written by somebody else who picks up on the idea. And this claim with this vicious sort of racist caricature here, the claim in this is that not only is mixed race marriage going to be allowed, but they're going to claim that there's going to be a government department that's going to go around murdering white men and forcibly marrying white women off to black men as part of this. So what you're getting is these kind of hysterical claims, claims that include ideas about imaginary government actions, a kind of imagined conspiracy. And one other thing that I want to point out to you guys about this is that what we have is a hoax trying to prove the existence of a non-existent conspiracy that is achieved through a real conspiracy. So it's not so much that conspiracies don't exist, but sometimes theories about fake conspiracies have frequently been concocted purposefully as part of real conspiracies. And so here's where I was after I learned about all this. I'll just tell you very quickly, how did I end up here? Almost 20 years ago, when Barack Obama was running for president and then became president, there was a lot of talk clearly about him being the first African-American president and the first mixed race president. There was a lot of talk then about the fact that in 1961, when his parents got married and when he was born, their marriage would have been illegal still in 16 states because of anti-miscegenation laws. And so that's how I ended up learning about all this. So I was amazed at this story, and I was also amazed that I had never heard about it. It remained undiscovered until Kaplan discovered it in 1948, and then the knowledge of it disappeared again. But here I was learning about it, and I knew about the Protocols of Zion and Henry Ford, and I thought, well, that's two racist conspiracies that had major impacts on the US. Were there more? And in fact, there were. And what I'm going to do very quickly is I'm going to tell you the two types that I found, and then I'm going to quickly show you just a list of the different episodes that I found, and then we'll go to having our conversation. So here are the two types that I found between the 1830s and the 1940s. And what I'll quickly tell you is that there was the heyday of this happening, maybe once a decade, sometimes twice a decade, was between the 1830s and the Second World War. It kind of went underground in the late 20th century and has been slowly resurfacing in the 21st century. And it basically came in two forms. One was fake evidence of an othered group being racially inferior. So an example of a recent claim like this might be the notion that like Haitian immigrants are eating pets or this kind of thing. It also might be, in a lot of the examples, is data around intelligence or morality of different races. And the other type was about conspiracies. So it would be false evidence about conspiracies against white dominance in the US. So basically, inferiority or conspiracy. And just very quickly, this is the big list. So I'll just read a little bit of this quickly just to give you a sense of the breadth of it, and then we'll go into conversation. So the first one I found was in 1836. This was an anti-Catholic hoax. 1840, in 1850s and 1865, 3 separate anti-black hoaxes, an anti-Chinese hoax in 1880, in the 1890s to 1920s, another anti-black hoax, and then in the 1920s, anti-Jewish, anti-immigrant hoaxes, in which I include both Henry Ford and the Protocols of Zion and the racial eugenics movement. And actually one that isn't in the book, but I've actually just discovered last week, is some hoaxing around Japanese supposedly traitorous activity with Japan and justifying internments. Then you have this lull in the end of the 20th century and the resurgence now. So I think in the course of our conversation, we can have time to, I can tell you more about individual episodes, but I think I'll try to stop at the moment.
Very encouraging.
It's going to be a laugh riot, don't worry. Oh dear.
Let me see. Let me try. His mic is better. May we share mics? Thank you so very much. So one of the things that I found in reading the book, aside from the fact that each one of the chapters is mind-opening, it's boggling that people actually believe these things. But then I started thinking about where we are today. And the first thing that came to my mind was that George Soros happened to send laser beams down to California to start the fires in California. And I thought about it for a moment and realized that there truly are people that believed it. And what I found fascinating is that there are so many people that seem to perpetuate these stories, and they're still there. If you don't mind taking a moment and just going over the Henry Ford situation. I mean, here we have somebody that was an American success story, came out of farm country, came up with a vehicle that put everybody behind the wheel, and yet was completely driven by a need to destroy Jews. And he gets a newspaper. He starts a newspaper, and he starts talking about the international Jews. That's the first thing out there, and about how horrible we are, which is very similar to a lot of what we're reading today about the international Jews. And then starts publishing this Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And unfortunately, from what I understand, there's still people reading it. So if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to talk about the effect that that's had on perpetuating a sense of anti-Semitism throughout this country, and how it's possible, even though it's been disproved and disproved and disproved, that people are still believing it.
Thank you very much. This is working for you guys now? Very good. Thank you. I think that the episode of Henry Ford's promotion of the Protocols of Zion is a really good way into this whole topic and this whole area. And one thing I would like to clarify first, just for our conversation, is that what I have been looking at is not simply false claims, right? So I make a distinction between a claim and a hoax. A hoax takes a lot more work. And so making false claims about your political enemies or your religious adversaries, I think, has been going all through human history. So the phenomenon that I was really looking at was efforts that took a lot of work to create seemingly objective false evidence to back up whatever prejudice one has and whatever policies that go with it. So in terms of Henry Ford, in my research, and a lot of this, he's been researched a great deal already. Some of what I found really interesting about Henry Ford I knew the basics. I knew that he had been, in addition to being an industrialist and being very famous, that he had been involved in this anti-Semitic campaign. And again, he starts this newspaper. He spreads, under the aegis of a kind of series called The International Jew, he is spreading all this kind of slanderous claims against Jews, and in particular, he is spreading the word about this document called the Protocols of Zion. I'm sure you guys are at least somewhat familiar with this, right? Claims of global economic and political conspiracy and the blood libel and all of this. I think this stuff will not be new to you, probably. Here's some of what was really fascinating to me and really overlaps with some other things, which is, and I will get to the question of why do people believe it. But a basic thing to know is that when Henry Ford began spreading these anti-Semitic ideas, he was enormously famous at the time. He was enormously rich and revered as a kind of example of a self-made man. And a lot of people really looked up to him. And he, in particular, because he had lowered the number of working hours for workers in his factories and raised their pay at one point, he was known as the working man's friend. So he had an aura around him. People associated with him, even at a time when people were very angry at the very wealthy and other industrialists. He had a kind of golden aura around him. He was supposed to be a self-made man, a regular guy. He had done all these nice things for working people. He had all this credibility with him. But a year before he started this newspaper, a year or 2 years before he began publishing the anti-Semitic campaign, he was in a court case over a libel case. And in the course, someone said something about him he didn't like. He took them to court. And in the course of it, he had gotten humiliated. Essentially, he was shown to be minimally literate, having not finished high school, not knowing a lot of very basic things about American history and other things. And what came out of that was a lot of people in the country sort of mocked him and felt like, oh, well, he knows a lot about cars, but not about much else. But a lot of people in the country, and we should really listen to this for the world we're living in now, a lot of people in the country felt like he was a regular guy being attacked by fancy, educated elites. And a lot of people in the country developed an intense identification with Henry Ford that said, he's being attacked by the stuck-up elite people who I resent, and I'm now going to believe anything that he tells me. And I'm kind of paraphrasing letters that he received. I'm going to believe you before I believe other people. And he went into his anti-Semitic phase with both the power of being a millionaire, the power of being able to own a media outlet, and this public persona where people both idolized him and identified with him and felt that his enemies were their enemies, and that therefore they had this incredible amount of credibility, momentum. He resents Wall Street. He resents financiers. He doesn't seem to have a clear sense of it. Early in his life, he hadn't really met many Jews. All throughout his life, he often confused financiers with the term Jewish. He would often accuse famous, well-known bankers of being Jewish, who were in fact Christians. So he wasn't a very sophisticated or knowledgeable anti-Semite initially. A member of his editorial staff introduces him to the Protocols of Zion, and he goes ahead and publishes these horrible accusations, broadcast them out to the world. This is very important. Within a year of him starting this propaganda campaign, with all of his credibility and wealth and celebrity behind him, in about a year, the protocols are definitively proven to have been a forgery. An English newspaper journalist figures out that the Protocols of Zion document, which purported to be the minutes from a meeting of a Jewish conspiracy organization. Turns out this British journalist finds out that in fact the document had been cobbled together from a couple of other earlier documents that had not been aimed at Jews. They were aimed at Freemasons and other people that the writers didn't like. It was repurposed to be about Jews and republished. This revelation was then spread around the world. So in terms of our conversations about hoaxes and about racist ideas and how racist ideas are used to justify and strengthen racist institutions, there's a number of things to think about. One of them is, well, how does someone like Ford end up publishing this information? How does he end up believing it? How does it get out in the world? But a key question is, what happens when it's revealed to be false? And we live with these questions today. What happened is Ford's response when the first revelation of it being a hoax said, well, I don't know, it fits the truth. So he basically said, I don't care if it's a forgery. He kept publishing it actively for a few years. Eventually, for business reasons, he shuts down the newspaper. He nominally says, oh, never mind, I don't believe that. But the book version of it, as The International Jew, is still being published around the world, including in Germany. Becomes a very popular book in what will become the Nazi state. And that work, as we know, continues to exist. It continues to spread anti-Semitism for, it's now over 100 years. And so that's, I don't know if you want to ask me anything in addition, but this is part of how I would frame it.
I guess my question comes down to all of this. Thank you. And I guess it's the hardest question to answer is the why. You can make up stories, you can document them, you can publish them. Certainly somebody of Henry Ford's background, when he lies, there's a certain amount of credibility that people believe because of where it comes from. But as you said, the London newspapers immediately they said that this was a forgery. And when you go down so many of these also, there was very quick denunciation of it. But people still believe it. And they still want to believe it. And I don't know if anybody can answer that question, but you've certainly done a lot of research on it. Why?
This is sort of the million-dollar question. I would actually, the question of why do people keep believing it after it's been proven false? In my answer, I would take us back to before the hoax has been made or become popularized, whichever one it might be. And my belief about this, all of this, is that for any of these things to have succeeded, there has to have already been a hunger for it. Because anybody can say anything, including any super rich person. There are lots of super rich people, publicizing their ideas all over. For something to really take off, it has to hit a public desire. And so the way that I have thought about this is that all of these episodes came in response to what I have called a public hunger and what I also call a market opportunity for false evidence, false racist evidence to justify a prejudice. So that it's that pre-existing condition. So if you wonder, well, why might someone believe that something is true even after it's been proven false, you need to go back to what was their state when they came to believe this thing already. It's not necessarily a neutral state where they happen to have believed it just like, this box of Frosted Flakes has 10 milligrams of carbs. Oh, it turns out that was wrong. It's only 6. I'm willing to believe that, whatever it might be, right? You have people who the enthusiasm with which each of these hoaxes was embraced is indicative of a hunger which it met, right? And what I would say in all of these cases is people in the US, basically white people, all of these are white supremacist hoaxes, right? In support of the belief of people at any given time who are within whiteness in the US. So an important thing to understand is that changes a lot over time. So the earliest ones that I find were ones that were anti-Catholic, and that eventually, which is religious, the US was mostly Protestant, eventually that becomes a kind of biological racism against the Irish as scientific racism comes along. But what's the basis of that? What was the initial hunger? It's anxiety over economic opportunities and political influence from a new group, and the discomfort that comes from a more diversified culture in which there are things that seem unfamiliar to you, right? So that combination of discomfort, but also self-interest, fear about losing economic opportunity, losing political influence. And when I study this, when I teach this with my students, I often try to boil it down to, I think most humans, if given the chance, would rather have more than have less. Most human beings would like to feel that they're doing the right thing and that they're doing the wrong thing. And so there's, I think, an inherent human desire that we all need to wrestle with, even in ourselves, to, are we justifying something because it gives us what we want, right? Does it give us more power? Does it give us more opportunity? And one thing I will point out as we might go through these is that each of these hoaxes, each of these episodes of creating false evidence against some particular group, well, why does that happen at some particular moment? It's in answer to some change. It might be a change in demographics, who's immigrating to the country at the moment. It might be in response to a political change, for instance, the end of slavery. If slavery is going to end, how do you maintain any kind of a white advantage? You end up with segregation. But how is segregation okay? Well, here's a thing that will make you feel better about it. Here's a thing that will let you justify it. And so if we come to all of these, including the anti-Semitic campaigns, with that understanding, a non-neutral positioning, then you can see that it was really doing something for someone, right? To have believed it, and they're very invested in it. And you can talk about economic or political interest, and also more psychological things about wanting someone to blame for any number of personal failures and this kind of thing. But the basic sense of, in all of these cases, even though the pretext in all of these and everything in the book is about false evidence, wanting to have something that seems like an objective way, the reason that you believe this racist thing is for an objective reason, you're not prejudiced, what people are really tied to is the conclusion that they want. And they aren't tied to evidence necessarily. And they're very often willing to let go of any sense of what proof might be, because the thing that it supposedly proves is so appealing and so beneficial and so soothing.
How do you fight it and debunk it? How do you go about fighting it and debunking it when you know flat out that it's total falsehood that's creating hate?
I don't know. That would be a quick answer. And I saw a hand out there, and maybe I'll try to take a first stab at this and then come back to you. Does that sound okay? So I'll just take a first stab at that, if that's okay with you. Okay, and then I'll go right to you. All right, sorry. The notion of how do you combat this sort of thing? I think that the first step is the most basic one, which is if something is being produced and put around as evidence and it can be proved to be false, the first thing you have to do, even if it's not sufficient to kill it, is to do the basic thing. Get the real information out. But then you have the challenge of there's a large population of people in any instance like this that are really going to be disposed to never disbelieve it. And they're invested in it in terms of their sense of identity in a lot of ways. So in the long run, it's very hard. But I think that letting people know the mechanisms by which these things can happen at least can give people a model for thinking about how are their opinions produced, how is this evidence brought about. But I'm happy to pontificate in whatever way I might about the big question. But one thing that I've looked forward to in terms of being able to come and speak at synagogues, and this is the first of 4 that I'll be speaking at this year, is a thing that occurred to me, which is, here's what's unique about the Protocols of Zion in relation to all the other things I wrote about in my book. It's the only one that's been known since the beginning and has been remembered. And so the Jewish American community has had 100 years of this question, has had 100 years not just of the damage of this document, but of having to wrestle with not only is this thing bad, but why it's already been proved false. Why is it still there? It's still it's available online. It's already been published. But shall we go to the speaker?
So my question is, if you go down this list, for the most part, openly being racist or hateful toward any of these groups is no longer accepted in our society. You cannot be racist towards blacks. You cannot be racist towards the Japanese. You can't be racist towards the Chinese. Why is hatred of Jews and racism against Jews so enduring and everlasting and acceptable? We are the only group on this list that it's totally okay to continue to hate us and be racist towards us. Why is that hatred so enduring versus all the other groups?
I have to say, I disagree. I disagree that we're not,
I didn't ask you.
okay, I'm sorry.
So I would like to hear it.
I just want to say in fairness that all these groups, including when we had the Asian, the COVID and all that, there's a lot of racism. It affects a lot of people.
There was one instance in New York City of racism towards a Chinese person, and the entire world went ballistic when that happened. But yet when the entire world is against Jews, it's totally okay. So I would like to ask.
No, I see it as broader. Not just.
It's accepted to be racist against Jews. It's not that racism doesn't occur against other people. It's accepted in the mainstream.
When a criminal was attacked by, when a criminal was properly dealt with in Minneapolis, the world literally caught on fire. But when thousands of Jews are slaughtered, then, that's okay. So I would just like to know, based on your research, why is hatred towards Jews everlasting and enduring versus these other groups where hatred towards Chinese was a moment in time and that is no longer the case?
So my quick response to that is that's not my area of expertise on the grand scale. I think what I can try to do is bring you my research, and I can partly see where you may take that information, and where in particular, a Jewish audience can go from there. And So I think what I might also try to do is, one thing that you mentioned, you were in your statement that it used to be acceptable to be racist to all these groups, and you're saying now you think that it's only Jews that it's acceptable, right? So I'm going to set that aside for the moment. Here's one thing that I will point out to you guys in terms of structurally how this has worked. From the 1830s until the 1940s, this is the heyday of scientific racism, which is to say, this is the period in which there was an unembarrassed mainstream racism and white supremacism. Not embarrassed, and it was cutting edge. What was cutting edge science? Absolutely racist, right? That was, mainstream science, mainstream history. One thing I'll point out to you guys is that before the 1830s, in the US, the primary mode of trying to prove or justify something in the US, beyond something being civic, say that the Constitution says it's allowed, this kind of thing, would have been religious. So some kind of reference to the Bible, to precedent, to something either being in accordance with Christian scripture, this kind of thing. Beginning in around the 1830s, the prestige of science escalated in Europe as well as in the US. And what you began to have is the prestige of science rose enough that there was a real appeal for anything you were doing, but in particularly for this big issue of race in the US. There became the notion that if you could have something scientific that was nominally objective, that could prove whatever your belief was or whatever policy you wanted, that there was an enormous benefit to that. And so that went on for this whole period. So in all of this period, up until the 1940s, 1830s, not only were there lots of these hoaxes creating false evidence, the reason people would be likely to believe it is that the world was full, 99.999% of the scientific or technical or seemingly objective evidence around race was made by earnest racists, which is to say that that's why people would believe these, because they were used to seeing evidence in data form that would tell you why this race was inferior to that race. They were embedded in it. And so after this, right, so after the 1940s, heading into the middle of the 20th century, you had a few things happen. Science turned away from ideas of racial hierarchy and eventually away from the idea of race. And so you started to have a separation between these two things that for over 100 years had been completely parallel in working together, which was the notion of what science said and the systems of white supremacism and the systems of racism in the US. So that was a problem for people wanting to support racism and racist policies because they no longer had the support of science. But it also freed them up. So basically, I call the period in the second half of the 20th century, especially the last quarter of it, the code word period. And so it's not that racist beliefs went away, and it's not that racist things like institutionalized racism went away. Race was still very complicated in the US. It was just no longer acceptable to make open statements making racist claims. But you could use code words, right? And so we've had a lot of time about, stories and notions about who is or isn't deserving of government benefits, all kinds of racially loaded things. But there was no longer nobody would believe, there wasn't a market, let's say that. There was no longer a market, a viable market for falsified data and stories because science was no longer behind it. Also in this time period, this is a big thing I think I haven't discussed yet. In the US, throughout the 19th century into the early 20th century, there was pretty much no expectation of objectivity in news, right? So we need to think very differently about that. The notion that that was always there and that the partisanship of today's media is this new arrival, it's not, right? So in the 19th century, newspapers were owned primarily by political parties or were directly aligned with individual political parties. So that was there from the beginning. The other thing that is in the book that you can learn about is the fact that American media and news culture in the 19th century had its own hoax culture. So there was a culture of newspapers producing hoaxes, sometimes just for a gag. Like there was one that was very successful about an astronomer looking through a telescope found flying monkey people on the moon. Sounds ridiculous, but it sold a lot of newspapers. Was that racist? No. But what it tells you is that was an aspect of American journalism. How prevalent was hoaxing in American journalism? Let me give you some names of people who I discuss in my book practicing newspaper hoaxing. Mark Twain, Abraham Lincoln, Edgar Allan Poe, Walt Whitman. And most of these were literary things that are now collected as short stories sometimes of Edgar Allan Poe's were originally published as hoaxes. So it's partly to say that the notion of what kind of news you were getting was a real free-for-all for most of US history. And it was just at the end of the 19th century when some journalists figured out that it could be a marketing tool to say that your newspaper was more objective. And you started to get that as a new kind of expectation. And then by the middle of the 20th century, you end up, what some of us can remember. There were only 3 news stations, or 3 television stations, right? A kind of centralized version of media. So in terms of the big picture, big question was, well, why didn't it just keep going at the same pace? Part of it was there was no longer the cultural atmosphere in which the production of things that openly claimed to be showing racial hierarchy was a viable thing that you could try to fake. It was no longer out there. But people went to code words. I have a chapter where I mostly look at Governor George Wallace as a way of looking at, in the 1950s and 60s, how politics moved away from open declarations of racism and moved more towards sort of code word politics. I think I'm not prepared to try to answer the world, the big world question of why attitudes towards Jews are such a complicated thing in the world. I personally would disagree with the notion that Jews are the only people experiencing any racism in the world. I do understand what you're talking about in terms of the feelings around the issues, what's going on now with Israel and Palestine and other things. I think the main thing that I can be maybe available to do is try to bring you some of the insights from my research, and you may be able to do something with that.
So, certainly Jews are not the only people experiencing racism, but kind of, more specifically related to your, conspiracies, hoaxes, and all of this, Jews are kind of at the center of concerted efforts by Qatar and tentacles of other, large organizations, basically where they're trying to say that Jews are, are doing Elders of Zion, Protocols of Zion type things in order to undermine Jews. And it's now extending, to the left, to the right. We're being attacked on all sides, and people are accepting this on both sides, and our aisle is narrowing here. So what can we do to counter these, these conspiracies, many of which say that we are committing conspiracies, including that Jews are genocidal, that Jews, on the right, there's the replacement, on the left, that we're genocide. We're both white supremacists and we're inferior, at the same time. So how do we combat all of those? And what has, I guess debunking hoaxes hasn't been always helpful, but what helps to undo hoaxes and conspiracies, and what's been successful from your research?
It's yeah, I'm going to make a pause here. It has been certainly very discouraging to me in the course of my research to see how long-lived these things have been. I think that the first step, especially if you're talking about an individual claim, right, is for someone to do the basic work of documenting its falsehood, right? I wish that was enough, right? But if nothing else, that needs to be done. And I don't have a big answer for you. If I did, I think I'd have another book about how to end all of these things. I hope you won't think of this as ducking it, but I'm going to try to go into where I feel like my strengths are. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about the first one on my list. This was a book that was published. It was a fake memoir published in the 1830s, at a time when there was a surge of Catholic immigration into the US. And it was a fake memoir by the woman who claimed to have been a Protestant, having been converted to Catholicism, becomes a nun, is then raped by a priest, and then they're murdering babies. There's all kinds of mayhem. And the book sells like hotcakes. It eventually comes out that she was never a nun, none of this is true. She was a sort of probably mentally disabled prostitute, and a Protestant minister who was one of her customers and probably got her pregnant, brought her to New York to help promote this book. Why did it do well? It did well because Protestantism had 200 or 300 years of literature about the sins of their religious enemies, the Catholics. But there was also new forms of publishing. It happened in New York. It was a media center. They were able to sell it widely. It had really salacious claims. It was also a time when America was nominally very prudish in its sort of Christian culture, but it was kind of okay to read things that were racier if it was in a nominally religious book, on a religious topic. The book sold enormously. It was the best-selling book by an American author in the US for 25 years before Uncle Tom's Cabin. How soon was it proven fake? About 2 years into it. How thoroughly was it proven fake? The group of Protestant ministers who concocted the whole thing sued each other in court over who was due how much money because of who had written what. So if you were going to try to invent a situation in which you could thoroughly dispute something, debunk it, that would seem like it. The book continued to be the best-selling book in America for another 20-something years. It eventually got knocked out of that spot, but it was still a hot seller 80 years later. So who was consuming it? It was a combination of some people might fully believe it, some people might know something about it having been false, but there was something really appealing. Honestly, it was a kind of pornography in a time when pornography was hard to get, right? So there's a range of people who were consuming it. How much they know about how true or it is or isn't varies. How many of them were burning down convents? Probably not many. How much did that contribute to, say, anti-Catholic feeling, especially, say, in some farm town where they had never met Jews anyway? They might be more willing, therefore, to vote for something that was anti-Catholic, this kind of thing. So it's another example of something in America where that lived a long time. I had never heard of it until I started my research, but you know who did know all about it? The Catholics. I found hundreds of articles about this in Catholic publications. So they really kept up a conversation. They kept seeing places where it was being published. They would go back and there would be efforts to try to take it out of a history book. If someone found a history book where it had been reproduced as a kind of truthful document, they went and tried to take care of that. But what also, eventually there was a Catholic president. Eventually there was prejudice against Catholics diminished over time. But we also have resurgences of it. So I think anti-Catholicism is not as virulent in the US, clearly, as anti-Semitism. But there are elements in the Christian nationalist universe that would take it to America should only be Protestant. So I know this doesn't answer your question. I wish I had a full answer for all that. But in a way, my fantasy coming here, coming to some other synagogues, is I'm curious how the Jewish American community has a century of having lived with the protocols, whereas most of the other communities targeted in these episodes, they've been lost to time. Most of them don't even know about it. One thing I might like to do in my further research is to sort of pursue that. What efforts have there been in the Jewish community, in the Catholic community, in the Chinese community to counteract episodes of these, and how successful are they? But it's pernicious. And the devilish thing in all of this that I found is that the power in these hoaxes is that they are posed as evidence, right? Is the ability to pose not as a claim, but as a fact, right? But it's always the desired result that is loved. It isn't a love of evidence and truthfulness, right? And so if someone is deeply committed and identified with it, the counteracting is not going to pull them out of it. But if there is a voice of debunking and a voice of clarification and a voice of kind of normalization and humanity that's also in the cultural mix, hopefully the public will be getting a larger range of those things. But as we've all seen recently, right, just proving something to have been faked seems maddeningly ineffective, in a whole range of issues. I think they want you to go up to the, does anyone want to go to the mic? Does anyone want to go to the mic? Oh, sorry, goodness. I sound like the Wizard of Oz.
Just wanted to say that I think the problem is that when there is anti-Semitism, for example, saying, okay, the protocols say Jews control the world. Well, we know that Jews don't control the world, but they will give examples of a Mark Zuckerberg, of a Jeffrey Epstein, of some of these guys whose names I don't know who own these sports teams, where Jews are very prominent and have a lot of influence. They will say, you see, right? So that is, I think that's one of the problems, that you can't always prove what they're saying is false when there's a grain of truth in some of the claims.
What's interesting, it's also a matter of how do people even think about proving something, right? So the notion that saying that you can name a certain number of Jewish billionaires, the notion that that's proof about, you know, like the racial makeup of the billionaire class is very different, right? So I think, I mean that the only way that I can think of to be responding to that is to look at, well, who exactly are the full range of billionaires, right? You know, if that's what someone's concern is. Actually, this gives me an opportunity to bring something up, which is as much as it's very easy and certainly appropriate for someone who is taking really vile actions on racist beliefs, right? To hate them and dismiss them. One thing that, for instance, I teach classes on this kind of thing. I also teach writing classes and classes on rhetoric. And one of the things that I talk about when I teach rhetoric is if you want to persuade someone, often you need to figure out what is it that this person cares about, right? What is it, even if someone has latched on to something false, what is the real thing that brings that emotion in them, right? And one thing that occurs throughout the episodes in the book is in a number of instances is the redirection of hostility or anger or desire for change around economic issues, right? Being redirected towards race, right? So what is this, if someone is very worried about Jewish conspiracy in world economics, you can have conversations with them, try to bring them facts. But what's really agitating them? Is it that they feel like it's really hard to get ahead now, right? Is it that they feel like they don't have opportunities? Is it that they feel like they're being surveilled by technology? And those are real issues, right? If people are afraid that their kids are going to be in a worse economic condition than they were, those are real things. Who has power over those things? Who influences those things? And so very often there have been some cases. So here's the case that I think is the most direct, clearest. The case of the hoaxes against the Chinese in 1880. So I'll tell you very quickly. The 1880 election was very close. They didn't know who was going to win. And eventually it would be John Garfield, but just barely. And a man named William Barnum, if that name sounds familiar, he was P.T. Barnum's cousin. He was the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, and he was as good as his cousin at manipulating public opinion. How are we going to get our guy in? There was a lot of agitation on the West Coast where the Chinese immigrants had come in to work in the gold fields and on the railroads. They whipped up concern about that into a kind of racist hysteria about loss of economic opportunities. But there's been a lot of really great research, right, that shows that the desire to ban Chinese immigration, which came 2 years after this election, after this hoax, was based around the idea of protecting white labor. But in fact, labor unions at the time, which were mostly white still, because that's who most of the population were, a lot of the labor unions were saying, we don't need to ban the Chinese as an individual group. What we object to is the way that they're being brought in, the way that white capitalist industrialists are hiring them and bringing down wages. So Chinese workers were being bought essentially in lots of 10,000, and they would pay a flat fee for them, and they would effectively get 5%, 10%, 15% of what white workers were getting. So there were labor unions at the time saying, what we object to is that practice by industrialists, that economic practice. So that's a kind of redirection. So there are arguments in that case that a lot of the politicians and the industrialists who were supporting them were more in favor of a racial message behind this rather than trying to change labor laws.
I want to be respectful of the time and the hour, and also, Philip, thank you so much for your time. Cindy, if you would like to.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening and for sharing the powerful insights of the Great White Hoax. Your work reminds us that racism in America has not only been fueled by fear, but by deliberately constructed lies. Lies that succeed because they affirm prejudice and serve self-interest. And as you showed us, this pattern repeats across American history. Before the Civil War, the pseudo-scientific theory of polygenesis claimed that different species of humans possessed unequal intellect and morality, an idea eagerly embraced because it justified slavery. And during the 1864 election, the miscegenation pamphlet falsely attributed to Abraham Lincoln an agenda of racial mixing, stoking fears of a disappearing white race to undermine Northern support. And in 1880, the fabricated Chinese letter gained traction because it validated economic anxieties about immigrant labor, much like today, right? So what is most unsettling is how familiar these tactics remain. In our own time, racial hoaxes have resurfaced in political campaigns, claims about Mexican immigrants as criminals or rapists, false stories about Haitians eating pets, and the long debunked lie that President Obama was not a US citizen, all designed to inflame fear and reinforce racial hierarchy. You also warned us about a growing new threat in your book about AI-generated hoaxes that fabricate convincing photographic, video, and audio evidence, quote unquote, to advance white supremacist narratives. Whether it's a fake image of Taylor Swift dressed as Uncle Sam endorsing a candidate, a deep fake voice of President Biden discouraging voters from voting, or a phony video implicating Kamala Harris in a hit and run, the technology may be new, but the intent is not. Thank you for giving us not only historical insight, but a sharper lens through which to understand our present moment and our responsibility to question, to verify, and to confront hate wherever it appears. We now invite everyone to join us just outside the chapel, where Philip Kadish will be signing copies of The Great White Hoax. Books will be available for purchase. Please stay and enjoy some light refreshments and continue the conversation.